What happens when the world's biggest superpower fires the first shot in an economic war, but the enemy hits back harder than anyone expected? In 2018, Washington thought it could strong-arm Beijing into submission. Tariffs, crippling, sweeping, historic, were slapped onto billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods. The message was clear: America first. But what followed was not the humiliation of China. Instead, it was a blowback so fierce, so devastating, that even American farmers, businesses, and consumers were forced to pay the price. This is the story of how US tariffs backfired and how China struck back with a vengeance. The year was 2018. The Trump administration launched what it called a necessary correction to decades of unfair trade practices by China. The United States accused Beijing of stealing intellectual property, manipulating its currency, and flooding the world with cheap exports. The weapon of choice? Tariffs. Overnight, tariffs on $34 billion worth of Chinese imports were imposed. Soon, that number ballooned to over $360 billion, from electronics to machinery to everyday household goods. Almost everything Americans bought from China got more expensive. On the surface, it looked like a show of dominance. Washington was flexing its muscles, hoping to bring Beijing to the negotiating table on American terms. But here's the twist. China wasn't just going to sit back and take the punishment. China hit back. And it hit where it hurt the most. Instead of targeting high-tech industries, Beijing turned its sights on something far more vulnerable: American agriculture, soybeans, corn, pork, beef. These weren't just products. They were the lifeline of the American heartland, the states that had overwhelmingly supported Trump. China, the world's largest buyer of soybeans, suddenly cut off purchases from US farmers, turning instead to Brazil and Argentina. The impact was immediate. Fields of soybeans went unsold. Grain silos overflowed. Prices collapsed. Farmers, once confident and proud, now stared at bankruptcy. The shockwaves didn't stop in the countryside. Factories across the United States that relied on Chinese parts suddenly faced skyrocketing costs. The price of steel, aluminum, and crucial components surged. American companies like General Motors, Caterpillar, and Harley-Davidson reported billions in losses. Harley-Davidson even announced it would move some production overseas to escape the tariffs. And then came the consumers. Everyday Americans, from single mothers shopping for clothes to families buying electronics, started to feel the pinch. Washing machines, up hundreds of dollars, smartphones and laptops, more expensive than ever. The trade war was supposed to punish China. Instead, it was bleeding America's own economy dry. What Washington underestimated was China's resilience. Unlike the United States, where political backlash can swing elections, China's leadership had the power to absorb short-term pain. And while tariffs hurt some Chinese exporters, Beijing countered with subsidies, state-backed loans, and a pivot toward new markets in Asia, Africa, and Europe. In other words, China wasn't retreating, it was adapting. Even worse for the US, Chinese companies began accelerating their push to dominate strategic industries: 5G technology, electric vehicles, artificial intelligence. While American companies were scrambling to cope with tariffs, Chinese giants like Huawei, BYD, and Alibaba were expanding their global reach. The trade war didn't cripple China, it pushed it to innovate faster. Back in America, the casualties of the tariff war grew. By 2019, the Trump administration was forced to roll out tens of billions of dollars in bailout packages to struggling farmers. But it wasn't enough. Suicides among farmers reached alarming levels. Entire towns in the Midwest saw their local economies collapse. And here's the cruel irony. Many of these farmers had been the most loyal supporters of the president who had promised to protect them. But the trade war wasn't just a duel between Washington and Beijing. The whole world felt the tremors. Global supply chains unraveled. European manufacturers reliant on both US and Chinese components faced chaos. Asian economies, tied to Chinese exports, saw growth slow. Even Wall Street panicked. Stock markets swung wildly with every new tariff announcement or countermeasure. Fortune 500 CEOs lobbied desperately for a truce. Meanwhile, China deepened its Belt and Road Initiative, strengthening economic ties with countries that were eager to fill the vacuum left by a hostile United States. In trying to isolate China, Washington had instead isolated itself. By 2020, the costs of the trade war were undeniable. Studies showed that American businesses and consumers, not China, were paying nearly 100% of the tariff costs. The Federal Reserve estimated the trade war had reduced US GDP by nearly 0.5%, costing the economy tens of billions of dollars. Meanwhile, China's economy, though hit hard, had weathered the storm. In fact, Beijing emerged with stronger trade ties outside of the US, more state-backed technology firms, and new leverage in global supply chains. The so-called Phase 1 trade deal, signed in early 2020, was less a victory and more a quiet retreat. China agreed to buy more American products, but it never met the promised targets. And the tariffs? Most of them stayed in place, quietly punishing American businesses to this very day. So, did the tariffs work? Number. Instead of forcing China into submission, they exposed America's own vulnerabilities. They revealed just how dependent US farmers, manufacturers, and consumers had become on Chinese trade. They proved that economic wars are never clean victories, but brutal stalemates with collateral damage on both sides. And perhaps most importantly, they showed that in the 21st century, no nation, no matter how powerful, can wage war on the global economy without bleeding itself. Today, tensions remain as high as ever. The Biden administration has kept most of the tariffs in place. New restrictions target Chinese semiconductors and tech companies. And China, far from retreating, continues to rise, investing billions in self-reliance and forming new alliances across the world. The trade war was just the beginning, because now the battlefield has shifted to AI, to 5G, to rare earth minerals, to the race for global dominance in technologies that will define the future. If tariffs backfired so dramatically, what will happen in the next round of this economic clash? Will America find itself isolated once again, or will China's own internal challenges finally catch up with it? One thing is certain, the fight is far from over. In a world where money is the new weapon and trade is the new battlefield, there are no winners, only survivors.